Okay, everyone, thank you for joining us virtually tonight. I know that the weather is challenging for some of you. Um, First of all, I'm going to do a little experiment once I get over the agenda here in a second to see how long we're going to stay on. And I'll explain why in just a minute. But thank you all for joining us. We're in class 2 of PA 509 Applied Political Economy. And I hope that everybody's doing well and has had a chance to do the reading. I realize some of you are having a challenge acquiring the textbook because with the supply chain disruption issues that exist, it's also affecting publishing. And so y'all may not have had access to it. That's why I posted chapter 1 online, and that's why I'm going to post chapters 2 and 3 tonight. But just wanted to say that I hope everybody's doing well. And what I'm going to do now is share screen. So hold on one second. It's actually easier for me to do this setup here at home than it is in the classroom because I can just share the screen. But again, I hope everything's going well with everybody. And that everybody's doing well. So what we're going to do tonight, if all goes well, is get into chapter 1, which involves normative frameworks. And if you had a chance to do the reading, this focuses a lot on philosophy, which I know y'all were thinking, hey, I'm going into public administration. We're going to be studying philosophy. And I will tell you that there is a philosophical aspect to what we do, particularly when we start getting into the discussion of politics. For those of you political science majors, y'all know this a little bit because it was part of your undergraduate education, hopefully. But there is a philosophical aspect to what we do, and that's covered a lot in chapter 1. It looks at some particular philosophies, and I'm happy to discuss any others that y'all may have. And then I'm going to take the opportunity to go into one of the class exercises based on one of the exercises at the end of chapter 1, and then we will review the week 2 assignment. But before I begin, and I have the board up, I just need to know, and again, this is not to shame anybody, because I'll be honest, I've had a rough 48 hours. How many of you have been able to do the reading on chapter 1? Please hit the hand raise button on your screen. Okay. So it looks to be about half of you from what I can tell. You can go ahead and put those hands down. So what we're going to do is we're going to start the discussion tonight. I think you will find this interesting. People who enter this field likely have a passion for something in particular, especially those of you who are already in the career. And what so I'll explain why. I did some studying of this, and I did read the chapter, but I'll be honest that I'm not fully prepared for this because I've had a tough couple of 48 hours. As you know, that I am a professional working in local government, and we found out that my boss, who's the city manager, is retiring, and her last day was today. We didn't have a lot of time to figure this out, so I'll be honest, I'm still in a little bit of shock from that. I also realize that some of you may not be necessarily at home right now. You may be doing this from a place of work. And I want to make sure with the weather that's coming through that everybody gets home appropriately. So we're going to have a class for about 40 minutes. And then what we're going to do is we're going to follow up on chapter 1 next week, along with chapters 2 and 3. Having had a chance to look at the material, I think we can finish covering chapters 1 as well as covering chapters 2 and 3 next week. So I'm not too concerned about it. This is kind of introductory material, and hopefully as you go through the reading, you will get a lot out of it and I won't have to necessarily explain it, but I want to encourage you to do the reading as we move forward. So let's go ahead and get into our discussion with normative frameworks. So the first question we have, and I kind of first of all want to start off with something from the introduction of the book. There are three goals of this text, and I think there are three good goals for our class. The first is to think about the normative foundations of policymaking, and that is to ask the question, what are the proper goals of public policy? And this is a very important aspect to it. I think one of the challenges that we have in the current society is we all can't seem to agree on some basic fundamental beliefs or fundamental objectives, or at least we don't communicate that. And in public policy, obviously, we're going to have different perspectives, we're going to have different life experiences, we're going to have different interpretations of the research and the material that's out there, and we're going to have different viewpoints. At the same time, there is this desire that we need to have, and it's been fundamental to this country as well as any successful nation out there, that we have some agreed upon concepts, and that's where normative frameworks gets in. Again, it's not that everybody's going to have the same philosophy or the same philosophical approach to what they do in public policy. It's how those different philosophies have similarities that can work together. And so I do think that's very important. The second goal is to think through some fundamental aspect of social life that's let me just say that again. Second goal is to think through some fundamental aspects of social life that create opportunities for public policy to make the world a better place. We call these aspects of social life social dilemmas, and that's what the part 2 chapters will get into. But why does public policy exist? Well, public policy exists to solve problems. And a lot of what we do is solving problems. They're either very basic problems like how to keep social order, or how to make sure that we have control of all of our trash, or making sure that everybody gets access to clean water. And I'm not saying that those problems are simple in their execution. I'm saying that those are basic things that we all understand. And then there are those more deeper problems that we seem to focus a lot of attention on today, about how do we address, social inequity that may exist based on where you live or based on the color of your skin, based on past policy implementations. How do we address other issues like those that affect the environment that have an impact on everyone? And we have to figure out, we have to do our best to try to work to solve these dilemmas. And then part 3, and the third problem, is to think seriously and conceptually about the politics, because we can come up with the best possible solution for any problem. We can do all the necessary research and policy analysis that covers that. But at some point, you have to implement it and you have to make it happen. And so much of what could possibly be done is stymied by the political aspect of it. And so that is what we'll discuss in the third part. And that's the third goal of this. That's the third general goal of this text. And I think it does apply to this course overall. So first of all, I don't want to call anybody out, but I do expect participation in the course of this session. So when we think about normative frameworks, let's first take that word normative. What does normative mean? Anyone?
So normative is generally talking about how things should be, or an ideal of how things should be, as opposed to descriptive, which is like how things are.
Okay. Anybody else?
I think it means in accordance to a given standard.
Right. That's more closer to the technical definition. I think both of these work. What does anybody else have any other thoughts? Okay. So that gives an idea of what normative means. So then what do normative frameworks mean?
Like guidelines to guide like acceptable behaviors for decisions?
That's true. Let me look at the text real quick because I did underline it. So that is a very good overall for that. There are three elements to them, and I'm pulling from the text on page 15. And I apologize. I had to go to the eye doctor this morning, so hopefully I'll have bifocals here in a couple of weeks. You won't see me looking below my glasses as I'm trying to read or looking like this. First, normative frameworks identify and clarify various normatively valuable goals. So they may talk about the idea that freedom is normatively valuable and distinguish various notions of freedom from one another. Second, they attempt to describe some of the trade-offs that exist between various goals. As you study in public policy, what you learn is that for every public policy, there are trade-offs. It is not necessarily possible to always benefit everybody in a given society with a set public policy, and not necessarily are all the impacts of a public policy positive. There are going to be trade-offs, there are going to be externalities, and it's important to understand that from a practical perspective as well as from a philosophical perspective. Third, they offer foundational arguments about which normative goals are actually valuable and how to balance the trade-offs between various normative values. So in this case, for instance, a theorist might argue that the fundamental standard for all normative decisions is equality. As a consequence, they may advocate for accepting some reduction in freedom as a result of the coercion necessary to redistribute wealth. And they talk a little bit about wealth redistribution in this case. That probably the most popular politician that makes this a focal point is Bernie Sanders, the senator from Vermont. And you know, obviously, coercion, redistribution of wealth is something that cannot happen in a totally free society. You can't forcibly redistribute wealth. There's some that'll take place through the market, but you can't make it happen in a totally free society. And so what they're basically saying here is that if equality of resources is what they seek, and as you will see, and as you saw in the reading, equality can be measured in a lot of different ways. And not all measures of equality necessarily mean they're going to equal to equality in other ways. But if you're trying to achieve equality of resources or equality of opportunity, as the case may be, there is some necessity to redistribute to address various inequalities that may exist. And obviously that does have an impact on freedom, because it does kind of adjust the scales in a way that may prevent certain people from having access. That's been one of the criticisms about preference programs and admissions or various forms of affirmative action. There's a perception that creates a lack of freedom, because it prohibits people from being able to, certain people in what would be considered privileged classes, from being able to have access to certain opportunities. So that's one case that's out there. But the key thing to understand is that what we're dealing with when we're looking at normative frameworks is we're trying to understand, we're trying to establish guidelines. My apologies for if you hear something over my Alexa. Just fun things that happen when you're teaching at home. But we have a need to try to understand and be able to work together. And so we personally, individually, from a philosophical perspective, we have to have guidelines or frameworks that help us be able to kind of develop what would be considered shared behaviors or shared decision making. And even if those frameworks differ in their actual structure, there needs to be some similarity between them so that we can work together effectively across aisles. That's one of the problems we have today, is that there seems to be either it actually exists, or it's a perception that exists too often, that people don't feel like they can communicate effectively with one another and work effectively with one another. And whatever the issues are that concern you, you kind of feel like there's this perpetual gridlock that exists, not just in terms of what happens in legislative government or what happens in the elected officials, but also in terms of actually making policy making to utilize those authorities that are available at the administrative level. So going further, we didn't get into the discussion of private and public morality. And we understand that normative frameworks are designed to provide guidance in this area. And these each deal with two different questions that we're trying to answer when we're comparing and evaluating the differences between public and private morality. What does public morality mean?
How governments ought to behave.
Yes, absolutely. And so that means, so if we know that, what does private morality mean?
How you individually behave or believe.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So that is a huge challenge in this country with our framework as facilitated and as we try to expand upon it and improve upon the beliefs that were advocated over around 250 years ago, in trying to make sure that they're accessible to everyone. This idea of individual freedom means that we're heavily dependent upon private morality to exist effectively in society. And at the same time, we have this issue with respect to public morality, or what the government should do. And a lot of the political debate that exists kind of deals with this question: what should the government be responsible for, and what should the private citizen be responsible for? And then there's also the issue of how they compare together. And there's an example that they give here on page 17, where they say, when it talks about the issue of redistribution versus charity. And this is similar to Senator Sanders' own comments. Senator Sanders is not a big supporter of private charity. And he has been very specific about that. He is a big supporter of government redistribution of wealth, but he's not a very big supporter of private charity. And this is one way of looking at it. This is not necessarily Senator Sanders' way, because he's never said it this way, but it gives this example of somebody comparing their kind of having this internal debate in public and private morality, saying, I am happy to give away much of my wealth as part of a societal effort to achieve greater equality. In other words, he's happy to pay taxes or through other coercive means willing to give his money to achieve it. However, if the rest of the members of my society are not going to participate, I don't want to make a large personal sacrifice with no appreciable consequences for overall inequity. Overall inequality, not inequity, inequality. So his view is, if I'm going to participate and everybody else needs, the view of this person would be, if I'm going to participate, everybody needs to participate. And that is one way of looking at it, taking into consideration both your views on private morality and public morality. Some other people, like, I'll be very honest, I have a very strong view, and I've worked in government for nearly 25 years, and I still have this view. But my view, honestly, is I don't like telling people what to do with their own money. That's not something I necessarily enjoy. I understand the importance of tax evasion. I understand the need to have those mechanisms in place, and we need to have those mechanisms in place. When it comes beyond that, whether it's telling somebody to put money in charity or put money or support higher taxes or whatever the case may be, I get personally uncomfortable telling somebody what to do with their own money, because it's not mine. And so that's a challenge that's a limitation that I have when it comes to giving advice, because I can see whether it's through the means of the government or through the means of private society, because we do kind of have a conjoined system in this country, where particularly when it comes to social issues, we rely both on public and private institutions to provide those resources that people need. And that was much more private early on in our history, and it's become much more a conglomeration of public and private sources. And I can look at what's going on in a community and I can say there are some real needs here. And depending on where those resources are based, you can sit there and say, well, there's some people that are just simply not stepping up to the plate. And of course you try to do the best that you can, but you also realize that there are people out there that have more resources than you do. So that's important for us to look at. So what I want to do now, and we're only going to do one of them, is that there are a couple of frameworks that are discussed in this chapter. And the first one, to be honest, is a very common framework that exists. And I think it kind of does describe kind of how things work in a lot of ways, and that is utilitarianism. How many of you were familiar with utilitarianism before you read this chapter? Raise your hand. Okay, some of you were, great. So amongst those of you who were familiar, kind of give me just a general definition of utilitarianism.
I've always thought of it as the way that the means justify the ends.
Okay, that's one way of looking at it. There are a couple of different. Sure, go ahead.
I would say it's more like maximizing the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest amount of people. In terms of, I mean, you could do it for like a policy, to where if you have a policy and it benefits society as a whole, that would be kind of a utilitarian approach if it maximizes everybody's happiness above just one person.
Okay, so it's a majoritarian approach in that we're looking to try to achieve the needs of the many or the wants of the many. We kind of hear it now in the days, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. Lydia, was there anything else you wanted to add?
No, I mean, I was just saying that the means justify the ends. And so it kind of goes with what I believe it was Ian who was
Right.
speaking.
Okay.
Like, yeah, you get it.
Okay, understood. Your hand was still up, so I just wanted to make sure.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay. In general, there are a lot of positives with respect to utilitarianism. I'm going to turn share off here. There are okay. My apologies, the chat had not come up, so I see where the chat now is. There are some advantages to utilitarianism. Ideally, in utilitarianism, everybody is treated equally. And throughout the course of our society, in the history of particularly American society, there has been this push, and there's this often conflict, but generally speaking, it's in a move to progress to the idea of equal treatment to everybody. And we advocate that with the concept of equal justice. We try to achieve that to the promotion of equal rights. These type of movements, these type of efforts are in many ways utilitarian, because it's the idea of trying to achieve equality for all. There's also the fact that it allows that this concept of utilitarianism gives us the ability to really effectively look at trade-offs from a social or from a macro level social perspective. If done properly, it allows us to be able to evaluate trade-offs, which are very important, because again, taking action one way is going to lead to some trade-offs in other ways. That's the nature of economics. That's the nature of how the real world works. Another argument is that utilitarianism can at times be less pragmatic and more philosophical. And this gets to the idea that is often talked about, that concept known as the social contract, that in a given society, here in the United States, but it could even be smaller or larger than that, that there is this kind of agreement that exists, particularly between the government and its people. We have this concept, this ideal that we are governed, that it's a government led by the consent of the governed. And that's the ideal, not to say that it's always necessarily an application. It is the ideal. And that the social contract exists, that the citizen agrees to certain things, certain normative behaviors, and that the government also has its own responsibilities, and that if each side fulfills that contract, then everything is fine. That's generally something that's perceived, and it's philosophical, and that oftentimes is supposed to be in place, and supposed to be kind of a guideline or a set of guidelines to how the government proceeds with policy and how people proceed with their own behaviors. And when there's a lack of balance, it can be perceived that either citizens aren't living up to their side of the bargain, or the government isn't living up to their side of the bargain, or both sides could not be living up to their side of the bargain. Now, there's a problem with it, in that with this kind of social contract approach, people that unfortunately, as this contract is being developed, people tend to push for a social arrangement that serves individual interest and not those of society. And as such, any social contract will reflect particular interest in power relationships, just not the general social good. And this is kind of ties into the debate that we're having right now, that there are some people who have real problems with the nature of how American society is structured, from who was responsible for structuring it and their position in society when they did that, to kind of how it has evolved over time. And this gets into that discussion of power, which ties to critical theory. Now, we're not here to discuss CRT because it's not part of the class, but in general, critical theory overall, which includes critical race theory, is about the evaluation of power and who has it and how it is used over time to foster various realities, such as inequality and inequity. So we have a that can be perceived. At the end of the day, all these ideas are created by humans, and humans are fallible. Humans are not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. So when we think about philosophy, when we think about frameworks, we have to remember that these are not just implemented by humans, but they're also developed by humans. And so they can be developed without clear understanding, with a bias towards their own experiences or their own position or their own inherited power. And those are things that we have to keep in mind. There was an example in here about an experiment dealing with the concept of the veil of ignorance. I'm not going to get into that. It is very interesting to look at, but I don't, it kind of starts getting deep into looking at certain things. But there's a lot of things that we have to think of. And going to page 22, looking at the formulation of utilitarianism by Jeremy Bentham, people's preferences are their own. So this kind of gets into a later discussion about libertarianism, but we have the belief from Bentham when it comes to utilitarianism is that whether or not we have a moral standing to judge that from which another person derives utility, or for the sake happiness. The concept of the pursuit of happiness that was promoted in our Declaration of Independence is a very strong allowance to the individual, because what you're recognizing from a utilitarian perspective is that everybody has the right to pursue their own happiness, and it is not really up to any outside agency, particularly the government, to necessarily try to regulate that, unless someone's pursuit directly, and very clear here when we're talking about this directly, and that's why we have a system of laws, directly inhibits the pursuit of happiness of somebody else. And that's kind of the original philosophy that our founders tried to advocate for. imperfectly, of course, and they still tried to advocate that that philosophy. And so we have this, but it does create its own problems. We have this issue. There's a lot of different concepts in here. But then, of course, we have to look at this concept that we know of as this issue that we've seen overall. So what I'd like to do is what I'd like to do is break everybody up in groups for about a 10-minute exercise. So I'm going to break you up in groups of probably 5 or 6. And what I want you to do, hopefully everybody in each group is got a copy of the book. I would like for you to try exercise 1. And I'll give you 10 minutes and then I'll call on the group. So let me set up this. It'll go to breakout rooms. Is everybody okay with that? Okay, so we're gonna go with exercise 1. It's on page 47. You'll be automatically assigned to your room. It's about 6 or 7 in each group. And we'll do this for about 10 minutes, okay? All right, starting now.
And to complete that opportunity from a specific low income group of people, it can speak to that as a con because you're completely taking that option away from someone.
Okay, Jessica?
Yeah, I was gonna mention earlier, just if you do put the car out, regardless of the safety concerns, you're also putting these already vulnerable populations in a position where if they get in a wreck because of the car, that it would then in long term make them have higher medical bills or cause a bigger barrier in their life.
Okay, Tara?
I was going to say, no matter which way you go, it would, I think a libertarianism view would be it's up to the manufacturer what they sell, because it is the freedom of their freedom of market.
As well as up to the owner, the buyer, the whole concept of buyer beware. Okay, excellent. I appreciate everybody for working on that. I can tell y'all definitely pulled from more of the reading than we covered tonight. So I really do appreciate it. So what I'm going to do, because I promised that we would I was going to finish up around 7, is we're going to look now at the assignment reminder. Everybody can see my screen, correct? Okay. So first of all, I think some of y'all had sent the information about your reading groups, and I think even one of y'all had sent me information about a project group. For your project groups, and again, try to get to 3 if you can. Email me the name of the people that are going to be in the group by 6 o'clock next Thursday, so before class next Thursday. Next week in the text, we will continue discussion of chapter 1, look at libertarianism and Kantianism, and then also get into chapters 2 and 3. There's one article/video currently in the document in the week 3 folder for additional viewing and reading. I hope to have tonight a couple of other ones in there as well. So that is our plan for next week. Are there any questions with respect to the assignments for next week? Yes, Shannon.
Oh, I was just gonna say, is there like a class forum that we can make groups in? Because as someone in a different department, I don't really have any like way to contact any of the people in this class?
Sure. I will try to see what I can set up in Moodle and let people know.
Okay.
But you're right. I should do something. So I will work on that. Okay.
Okay, thank you. Also, if anyone needs a group, I'm available.
Yeah. Okay. I'm gonna leave this open for a couple minutes because I see a lot of chat action right now about people looking for groups, and I want you all to be able to communicate. So I'm gonna leave this open for about 15 minutes until I stop seeing activity. But I'm gonna go ahead and close myself out. But I just want to thank everybody for attending and hope everybody stays safe and enjoys the weather to the best of your ability. But you all take care, and I will talk to you all again next Thursday. Good night.
Thanks, Heather.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night, guys.
Good night, everyone.
And I messaged you if you wanted to be in a group.
Yeah, let's do it.